All right, here we begin.
And Judy, just ground rules, would you prefer that we hold our questions or?
No, just pipe up, actually. If you have a question, just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask it.
Thank you.
Well, this is our beautiful slide that you'll see at the beginning of most of the presentations today. And when we're talking about social justice, diversity, and equity, I think it's really important to understand that what we're trying to do a lot of the time is, we're swimming upstream against the person's educational background and against the problems that people are going to have making the leap to, in this case, we're going to be talking a lot about higher education, but it occurs at every level of education, really, that you're talking about the exact same thing. Transformational learning is something that happens across age groups and across all kinds of grades and times and periods of life. I've got a little, my dissertation topic, educator experiences when supporting students at what we think of as stretch points in their learning. So yeah, we're talking about stretch points in their learning today for sure, Linda. Thanks for that comment in the chat. So we're going to talk about transformational learning. What is it, why it's important, and how we can encourage it. And of course, in order to do any of that, we've got to have a definition for transformation. And here are some of the beginning definitions of transformation. They're very simple: a significant change, a metamorphosis, and then finally in 1978, a change of worldview. And that's Meisro. And as you probably all know, since you're here at this presentation, Meisro is the father of transformational learning. He's the person who created so much buzz about it. And his definition is the one that holds sway right now, although he had to become more specific. So the first time I ever heard anybody use the term transformational learning was in a conversation I was having in probably 1975 during the humanist movement about how we did grading in classes. And I was talking to one of the clinical psychology guys, and he told me that a person could get an A in his class if they made a transformation. And so I asked him, next slide, if I get an A, if I become a werewolf in your class, will I get an A? And he just laughed and, blew me off. But honestly, it's a good question. And it's the question that really haunts the whole area of transformational learning, because I think we're not willing to take responsibility for the values that are embedded in the ideas of transformation that we come across in the literature at this early stage. Nobody wants to say anymore that something is better than something else. And I think in the case of transformational learning, we have to take responsibility for that, take responsibility for saying that something is better than something else, and then be very clear about what that something is. And so there's been a huge struggle in the area of transformational learning about what a transformation is. What does it mean? And so next slide, Elena. This is a little bit about worldview here. because we're trying to expand now on that definition that Meisero offered, that it begins with the assumption that the worldview shapes and limits one's perception, cognition, emotion, and behavior by predisposing intentions, expectations, and purposes. But we still don't know what a worldview is. This sort of, talks about it a little bit. It's one of Meisero's early ideas about worldview, but it doesn't really tell us what a worldview is. And so we're still stuck with, we don't know what a significant change is. How big does it have to be a significant change? And if it's a metamorphosis, which is a terrible way to define it, in my opinion, a metamorphosis, that includes the werewolf problem. And the worldview at least gets us a little bit out of the werewolf problem, since werewolves don't have worldviews, but it doesn't define what a worldview is. We need to know exactly what a worldview is in order to operationalize it and nurture it. Okay, next slide. So in 2008, then, which is fairly recent, given how long we've been talking about worldview. We've been talking about worldview by this time for 30 years. Meisero says transformational learning is perspective transformation in which there's a structural change. And this is important toward inclusive, discriminating, integrative experience and a more critical stance towards society. So inclusiveness and integration and discrimination are part of what's involved in transformational learning, but it still doesn't tell you what transforms. It says there's a structural change, but structural change is almost as mystifying as transformation, in my opinion. It does not really clarify anything. It tells you that if you achieve this transformation, you will be, their thinking at least will be more inclusive, discriminating, and integrating, but it doesn't really help us in trying to build a program that will be based in transformational learning. Now, I actually created this slide deck and this talk for Duke University because the undergraduate professors there were considering creating a transformational learning program and a group that would function, extracurricular group that would function about developing strategies and curricula that would support transformational learning. Next slide. So Meisero then tells us that reflection on content, reflection on process, and reflection on premise are part of the strategy for creating transformational learning. And that only number 3 is transformational. I thought this was pretty cute. It tells us to look for students to answer these 3 questions in a way when we're trying to create more transformational learning. What's the problem? Let's say climate change. How did it come about? Because of human activity. Why is it a problem is probably the most interesting question of all. Why do we care about it? I think we skip that a lot because it includes values again. And teaching values is kind of, although we're doing it all the time, to do it explicitly is a little bit of a risky business because we can have a lot of arguments with people about values that we're teaching and create a lot of havoc when we start teaching values. But it's required if we're going to look at the problem of transformation. Again, even with these 3 keys, here's how to create transformation. We still don't know what transformation is. We know we can come to it through reflecting on why something is a problem. but we still don't know what worldview, what structural change, what metamorphosis, how are all of those manifested in people's behavior. Next slide, Elena. So then we get to some of the early critiques of Maizero. And here's one that I think is particularly important, and this is Dirks. Dirks is a very active thinker in educational psychology and has taken Maizero to task for defining transformational learning in terms entirely of rational thought. And I think that is a problem with all of developmental psychology. Development is most keenly defined, most carefully defined in terms of rational thought. And it does not include personal and imaginative ways of knowing that are grounded in intuition and emotion. And it doesn't even include emotion at all. So it doesn't take any account into how people are feeling about the learning that they're having. And that's often extremely important, particularly when you're trying to get people to make big leaps in their development. It's going to be sometimes scary. It's going to look complicated. It has to be broken down. It needs to, often when people make a transition from one way of looking at the world to another way of looking at the world, they leave behind the people that they hold close in their lives. The anxiety that's provoked by making a big change in how you look at things is a pretty grave issue. And not only is it difficult to make that change in terms of the amount of effort that you have to put into thinking and reflection, it also often tears you away from your context, because now you're thinking in a different way, using a different worldview, more inclusive, more complex than the people around you. And it can cause difficulty. I don't know about you guys going through graduate school, but when I went through graduate school, there were huge numbers of divorces. And I think that has to do, of course, with the stress of graduate school and all the other things that were going on at that time in our lives. But there's a lot going on now too. You know, we were in the middle of war with Vietnam in the period that I'm talking about in graduate school, but there's just as much going on today as there was then, and that's for sure. So it can be isolating. And I don't know if any of you have experienced that you're thinking now in a way that the people around you don't follow very well. You have to break it down. One of the points of graduate school, in a way, is to make your thinking more complicated so that it's going to be important to be able to explain it in simpler terms to people. Next slide.
Just
Judy.
a moment, Judy. You have Tessa who raised her hand.
Oh, sorry, Tessa, go.
That's okay. I just wondered if this idea of how it changes your worldview. When I've worked with adults, even young adults in high school, but primarily I work with adults 18 and over. And when they start changing their view of what they're good at, like they say, oh, I've never been able to do math before, or I've never understood this, or whatever. Suddenly their worldview changes, and it causes a great deal of stress in their life, because their friends see them a very particular way. And this, I wonder if it's this emotion and that of seeing yourself differently and having to redefine yourself in your system. is one of the reasons why people have a hard time getting their high school diploma or changing something about themselves in adulthood. Like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, one of the songs I hate most in my life is this song by, I think it was Billy Joel, probably it sounds like him, you know, don't go changing just to please me. I like you just the way you are. I wanted to say, I like you just the way you are and the way you aren't, you know, like don't change anything is not really something we can ask of another person. We're asking them not to grow. And I do think that a lot of people feel that way. They don't want their partner to change. They don't want the people around them to change. It's too difficult when people change. So it requires a lot of you. And I think that it is a downside both of changing one's worldview and also of being creative or innovative. Any of those kinds of things will make other people extremely nervous. So it makes them protect their territory. It makes them pull harder on you to keep you in the same place that everybody else is. So that when you talk about changing rational thought, you're really talking about changing a person's whole life. And that's a really important thing to remember. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we go along today. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here's the first thing that I think starts to be measurable. That is a good operationalization of the concept. Because Hogan says it's a process that results in significant and irreversible changes in the way a person experiences, conceptualizes, and interacts with the world. It's true that the changes that we are looking at in transformational learning are irreversible, but they can also deteriorate. So a person can make a change, and if it's not supported at all by the venue that they're in, and they don't have the kind of opportunity to talk to people who are thinking in a different way, because their world is composed of people who think under the worldview that they came from, it's going to be very scary proposition for them and for the people around them. And once you start thinking, or once you start using a different worldview, it's very difficult to go back, if not impossible. The kinds of changes that I'm going to talk about later cannot be reversed. You can no longer think the way a 10-year-old thinks. You can understand their thinking from the level you're thinking at, but when you interpret sense data, it does not occur to you that the clouds are moving because you walk, which is the way, say, a 5-year-old understands relative motion. You can try, but you can't really accept that reality. Okay. You can see why a 5-year-old might think that the clouds move because he's walking, but you can't actually perceive it that way anymore. You have a very different way of perceiving clouds. You know that that's not related to yourself. 5-year-olds think everything happens because they do something. So, for example, 4 years ago, when my son-in-law died, he died of very aggressive cancer, and his kids were 10 and 6. And the 6-year-old, we spent probably 2 years trying to convince her that it had nothing to do with her that her daddy died. It didn't have to do with how she took care of him. It didn't have to do with her helping out. Yeah, Linda says evocative example. I have a memory flash of thinking about cloud movement. That's great. Yeah, so it's very difficult to unconvince a 5 or 6-year-old kid of the propositions it has about how the world works. And the proposition that they have, the underlying proposition of a 5-year-old is everything happens because of me. Right? It's a very egocentric way of thinking. And as we move up or away from that way of thinking, I try not to say up, I try not to say higher, because as we'll see, certain ways of thinking about things are actually well suited to certain kinds of environments. So the most complex, most discriminating, integrative way of thinking is not particularly adaptive in certain kinds of environments. So we'll talk about that a little as well. Where are we? There. Okay, now we are. The next slide. Okay, so this is O'Sullivan 2002. This is another critique of Meisner, which I think is very important. It's a shift in consciousness that changes relationships with others and nature and increases understanding of race, class, gender, body awareness, and the sense of possibilities. What he's talking about here is that a transformational change is a change that includes thought, feeling, and action, right? So because we make a transformational change, we feel different about things and are likely to take different kinds of action and have different kinds of reflection on that action. Yes, we have a list of references at the end, and we'll send out this, I can send out this deck to you. All right, so next slide. So you make the assumption that the way people learn and the way they also unlearn has to do with how so much learning is grounded in governing ideas and social norms, in a taken for granted frame of reference. So we know that from the emphasis that we're now putting on equity and social justice, but we don't often act as though it's a really important part of learning. Do we take that into consideration? One of the ideas that Fielding was founded on was the idea that you meet the student where they are. So you need to take a cruise through how somebody is thinking in order to be able to come right at them where they are, right? And widen or broaden or expand their way of looking at things from there, rather than talking to them. If, let's say, you're a systems thinker, talking to them about how systems interact, when you're talking to a 14-year-old kid, it's not going to do you any good. So they're not going to understand it at all, especially in a classroom situation where you can't do anything one-on-one in a very reliable way. They're not going to be able to understand what you're talking about. So you need to start where they are, which might be at a fairly early stage, especially for somebody like Tessa, who's dealing with adults that don't yet have their high school diploma and don't really have the basics of mathematics. Okay, next slide. So the structures that we're trying to change, the structures to which Meisner referred when he talked about the structures that we're trying to change, are habits of mind or meaning structures based on cultural assumptions, okay? So at certain stage of learning, at certain stage of development, we assume that the authorities are right and everybody should act in accord with the authorities. Or we could say at that same level, the authorities are all wrong and we shouldn't wear masks or get a vaccination because it might be dangerous or it might not work and it's inconvenient and it's stupid. That's a certain way of thinking about things that suggests that people really do not understand the system they're operating in. Okay, so it's important to know what the cultural assumptions are that we are faced with in trying to create a transformational learning experience for people. And once we know that, the other thing we know is when people adopt different cultural assumptions than the people around them, again, that's another reason it explains why there's so much anxiety about a certain kind of learning. So ideology is what prevents agents in society from correctly perceiving their true situation. And we certainly see that now in politics all the time, where people seem to be acting against their own best self-interests. So that there's a cultural assumption driving them that isn't making any sense. Right. The cultural assumption here might be something like science is oversold as a way of solving problems. Science is used as a rationalization for making people do things that they don't want to do. So I think that it's important to understand when we're talking about creating transformational learning, that it's going to be difficult for the students, not just intellectually, but also emotionally, especially at the early stages that might put them ahead of other people around them. Okay, next slide. All right, so here's where we are with regard to transformational learning. I don't think that transformational learning is going to last as a construct. And a lot of people in the field don't think it will either. As Newman says, there are so many definitions that one wonders whether transformational learning exists as it is so poorly defined, or Dick's. There's such a proliferation of interpretations, one might as well think that there's no such thing as transformational learning, just good learning. The field is in danger of collapse. So it might not be such a great idea to think that you want to undertake a transformational learning curriculum, or you want to put one together that will create a transformational learning curriculum, as they're doing at Duke. And they asked me to come back because I told them to discuss all this and then we'll do another take of it, because it's not, I'm not sure that that's the best thing to call it or the best way to go about it. So I'm suggesting a solution. Change slides. Next slide. My argument here is that developmental psychology affords the solution that people are looking for. Transformational learning is learning that leads to a change in stage of cognitive development. Now, stage theory has been around for a long time. I am pretty much an advocate of stage theory. There's tremendous amount of work behind it, beginning with Piaget, and with hundreds, if not thousands, of articles that have been published over the years about whether stage theory is absolute or not. In other words, can you teach people something that is not according to their stage theory they shouldn't be able to learn? That's one of the questions. In fact, Child Development, which is the premier journal in child psychology, stopped accepting articles on this subject in about 1980 because there had been so much controversy and so many things published. And it seems very clear now that the sort of the heat has died down around these things, that it is true that people develop in a stage-like manner in terms of rational thought, and that it is irreversible. There are certain kinds of statistical tests that will allow you to say whether something can be reversed or not. These have been run, they've been run cross-culturally. There's a lot of cross-cultural work on stage theory. And so some of the things we know from these kinds of research projects is that higher level, or what I want to call later structures of thinking, are not spread equally across different kinds of cultural settings. So when you are looking, for example, at a tribe in Brazil that lives pretty much in isolation from the rest of the world, most of the people in that tribe are going to be thinking at about the 12-year-old level, maybe some inklings of what we would recognize as adult cognition, which is the ability to think scientifically. And most of them will not. Most of them will be at concrete operations. Now, is there anybody here that's not at least passingly familiar with Piagetian stages? Anybody that's not familiar? Great. So about 50% of the American population functions at concrete operations. Formal operations, which is scientific thinking, are taught really and reinforced and supported in high school. So in high school, we learn how to use evidence, how to make a linear argument, and usually get the idea that there is one true solution and it's mathematical and we can get there if we try hard enough. And it's a very important stage of thinking, because you can't really understand science if you don't have formal operations, because science involves probability, and people who don't have formal operations don't understand probability. So that's the issue that we're facing in trying to retrain most of the population to understand science and what the importance of science is, and where it fails and where it succeeds, and why it fails and why it succeeds. Those are all things that most people in the United States and across the world do not understand. So it explains a lot about why it's hard to communicate something like the dangers of climate change, which involves a lot of probability and not certainty. We don't know for certain that when we get to this certain number of degrees centigrade, everything's going to fall apart. We don't know for certain that that's true, but we certainly think that it's probable. So a person comes on a day like today, it's foggy, it's cold, it's going to be like this for the next 6 weeks, maybe longer. And people will say, see, no global warming. It's really going to be a cold summer. You can't really predict what's going to happen with the weather. All right. So the issue there is not understanding probability. You can't understand whether something is happening or not by looking at one piece of data. You need to have at least 3 data points in order to make a line of some kind, so that you can look at whether there is a function or not, whether there's an increasing function or a U-shaped function or a decreasing function. All of those things really require, in math, 3 points in order to be able to say something reasonable about the future. Okay, so what we're doing in graduate school, our focus, if you haven't noticed that from the curriculum at Fielding, is on systems thinking. The next stage after formal operations are in place and really well impounded, really well drilled in, is systems thinking. And we start thinking systematically in high school. If we have well-developed formal operations and we begin thinking, well, maybe there isn't one true solution. When you come across what's called a wicked problem requires all kinds of thinking about alternative solutions. There may be 3 or 4 possible ways to solve a wicked problem, and your job is to try to figure out which one will be most efficient and least destructive. You can't just assume that there is one true answer, because any problem is embedded in a multivariable system, and that system will affect it differently depending on the conditions in the system. And so the problem will need to be solved differently under different conditions of the system. So we spend a lot of time at Fielding with students trying to help them or support them in understanding the complexities that have to be addressed in solving significant social problems. In order to understand that and have a ghost of a chance at trying to solve some of those problems, you really have to have systemic thinking. You have to be thinking in education. We're always thinking, how does the economy affect enrollment? How do the federal regulations affect enrollment? How does the kinds of reports that we now have to make to the federal government about the progress of our students and about our goals and objectives, how does that get affected by changes in administration, by global problems of certain kinds? So there's all these very big external issues that are constantly impacting how we think on the inside of higher education, as well as working inside of the educational system. We have to consider the economic system, the government system, regulations, problems that the community is having in the area that we're at, the general level of thinking in the community that we serve, and so forth. All of these things will affect how we act in the end and how we feel about it. One of the problems with being a systems thinker is that it's easy to get overwhelmed, since your understanding is that you have to take into account all of these systems, all of these ideas that other people have. You have to seek other people's perceptions, and you have to include those in your thinking. So for example, whenever you want to make a change in education, you got to go through at least 5 committees and also get approval from individuals as well as committees. So you have to think all the time, what is it going to take to get this thing through my system? Not even looking at the bigger realities outside that might drive the problems that you're encountering in the system. So it can very easily lead to people feeling immobilized. And you can understand that. I've been having a discussion on a local bulletin board called Neighborhood, something like that. Anyway, they were talking about global warming. And I just wrote a note about how I'd been not buying more plastic bags for the last 2 years and trying to see how long I can make my plastic bag collection last. And the truth is, you cannot avoid buying plastic bags. If you buy bread, you're probably going to get a plastic bag. So now I have like about 10,000 plastic bags, and I wash them all and put them back. And I haven't had to buy a plastic bag forever. So I just wrote something about that. And another person answered me and said, in 2016, people were asked whether they would spend $15 more a month on their utilities to help make climate change. And people said, no, they wouldn't spend that much money on climate change. And so I said to him back that 2016 is a long time ago in terms of the attitudes we have about climate change. Attitudes toward climate change are changing very quickly. And it's always okay to do the right thing, even if you're the only one doing it. And I think it's so complex. What he said was, there's nothing that an individual can do that will make a difference. We have to believe in technology, that technology will help us overcome that. The only way that we can do it was government intervention and technology. And while I believe that's important in the solution, it's also important that that be supported by the attitudes of the system in which those solutions are embedded. Okay, so Michael Common's work is the work that really cemented the idea of stages, because he was able to show that you have people on the planet in adulthood that have at least these 3 stages of development: the systematic stage, which I think most of us understand what I'm talking about, and the metasystematic stage, where you construct multiple systems and metasystems, which is just what we were talking about. You know, when you're working on a problem, a curricular problem in your educational setting, let's say, there are so many forces outside of it that you almost have to be able to look at this system as a system interacting with another system. So you've got multiple systems interacting in a lot of places where you are trying to make change. And as you go on through working with systems, if that is required in your work environment, you learn how to construct multivariable systems and how to look at the ways that they interact. Development usually occurs in one domain. So let's say that I am a physicist. Development is going to happen very steadily and reliably in the area of physics if I keep going, if I keep getting myself educated to a higher level. Then I'm going to become very conversant at the even metasystematic level about my area of expertise. And we know a lot of people in the educational system who are extremely bright and who are able to understand the most complicated things in their field, but are actually jerks. And so I am also interested in why this happens. If you have a person who is at developmental level, that where they should understand systems and metasystems, at least in their area, why don't they understand it over here in how people interact with each other? Why doesn't it generalize? You know, well, one of the things is being in the university allows you to not deal with interpersonal relationships very much in your work. You don't work on a team. You don't have to collaborate. Committees are not collaborative groups generally, and they can't even develop much kind of team spirit because there isn't a commitment to a faculty meeting the way there is a commitment to a team meeting in a different kind of work situation. So again, the social norms that surround us really influence the level of thinking that we can do. Development at midlife is also correlated with the growth of neural connections. sometime around 40, in your 40s, there is another fairly steep growth curve of connections in the brain. So we know that at about 40, people are ready neurologically to take a step of some kind. And this is, in terms of this system, it would be into a more systematic way of looking at things. That's why it's so exciting to be working with midlife people in education, like we do at Fielding, because they're ready. They're here because they're ready. They're not because their parents sent them, and they're not because they're trying to find a marriage partner. They're here only because they really believe that an education will pay off, and they want value for their money too. So that's another thing you have to be aware of. Next slide. Okay, so Michael Common's 1978. This is the first article in which we see a really good outline of what he's doing in terms of using mathematics to show that there is a sequence you can't jump out of line in this sequence. You can't go from concrete operations to systems thinking. You have to go through formal thinking to get there. You must have formal operations in order to develop systems thinking. So the way that we can make changes, ordered changes in the structure of thought, is suggested by Michael. First of all, grappling with contradictory views. Not only do highly developed people seek the views are able to accept the views of other people, to think about them, to not reject them, but they're likely to seek out the views of other people. For example, if you're going to try to get something done in a higher education environment, I've always said you need to ride your fences. You need to have social support for the idea that you're working on before you formally present it. If you don't know where the resistance is going to be and where the support is going to be, you're much less likely to be successful. So you have to seek out those views. And then the final step of maturity in terms of dealing with contradictory views is to find a way to integrate them. What can we do with three people who disagree about something or who don't see it the same way? How do we integrate those views so that we can move this forward? That's a very difficult proposition. It needs to be carefully attended to, and you need also to be aware all the time when you're trying to introduce something like that. You are constantly aware of who's with you and who's not. And you have to be aware of who's not, that's not even speaking. So it's a complex matter, dealing with multiple points of view and understanding that there are problems, and the problems we deal with in education are almost all problems where there is no absolute truth. There is only probability that things will be successful or will work for everyone. There's no absolute truth. And there are many causes of any phenomenon. Most phenomenon that we're interested in are caused by many different forces and factors. That's why statistics allows us to peel out some of those things like socioeconomic level or personality factors or family settings. We're able to control for those. That's why if you go back to formal operations, if you don't have formal operations, you don't know how to control variables, because you can't predict which variables will be important. Concrete operational children make guesses about what to do in a science project. And if they're right, voila. And if they're not, they make another guess and another guess and another guess until they finally hit on something correct. They have no systematic way of moving through a problem, trying various solutions, knowing when you're really finished, when you really run out of trials of that solution to see whether it works, so that you have to move on to a different one. For example, if you present a 10-year-old with a panel of buttons, and the buttons can be used to turn a light on, and the combination that works is, say, 3, 5, 8. What the kid will try is 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 3, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 8. There's no logic to the way that they try various sequences. Whereas if you're working with an adult, they go 1, 2, 3, 1, 3, 4, 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 6. So they are constantly knowing what they've already tested and not doing that again. So that's a real easy way to see whether a person has formal operations, to see whether they can work their way through a complex problem like that, trying different combinations, but not repeating any, or repeating them only by mistake. Okay, so next slide. Where am I in terms of time here? 10 o'clock. All right. Self-authorship is a predominant concern of college.
Let me know if I can help.
Oh, sorry. I just somehow got Siri online. Self-authorship is the predominant concern of college-age students as they move toward internal differentiation. So all of these changes also have effects on a person's identity, and that's Keegan talking in 1995. There are certain characteristics of systems thinking and also well-developed formal operations that are important to understand. You have to come to see that knowledge is uncertain, and that's, we're talking about probability. You have to understand probability, and you have to understand that there are differing perspectives on even whether something is a problem or not. So if we say women only make 70 cents on the dollar when compared with men's salaries, okay, why is that a problem? It's got to be one of the questions that we ask. Do we have to focus on that? What are the values that are driving our understanding of it so that we say that it is a problem? So knowledge is uncertain due to differing perspectives. Some people will think that it's not a problem because, you know, women are raising children and they're not as focused on their careers. And so it makes sense that they don't make as much money as, there's lots of rationalizations for that fact that have to do with differing perspectives on whether it is even a problem or why it is a problem. And when you're trying to make changes, you need to work through all of those things. Knowledge is contextual. We know things will work in a certain context. We're not sure that they will work in a similar context. We're going to try them and see if they do. But we have to be sensitive to the fact that what we understand as good ways of operating may not work with another group of people. I'm constantly surprised by the things that I do or say that are offensive in one way or another to other people. And if I'm going to make knowledge, if I'm going to make teaching relevant and knowledge accessible to people, I'm going to have to take that into consideration. Whether I think it's fair or not, whether I think it's right or not, it doesn't matter, because we're talking about a change that includes a huge number of emotional outcomes. And so it's important to know where we start with someone. If they're resisting, or if they're open, if they're ready. You know, in Piagetian preschools and early kindergarten grades, we talk all the time about whether there's readiness, whether a child is ready to read, or whether a child is ready to learn math. We're having trouble right now with our 5-year-old, my 5-year-old grandson. He doesn't like letters. And he doesn't want to write, and he doesn't care about it. And you can't make him. He doesn't want to write his name. And if he does write his name, if he tries to, he writes it backwards and it looks terrible. And he's, I think, slightly embarrassed by it. He's not ready to write his name. If we wait another 6 months, he'd probably write it without any trouble at all. So you got to know when you want to push people, and when you just got to wait a while until they're readier for it. And obviously the way to teach in this manner is one-to-one, but we can't do it even at fielding. With as much one-to-one as we have, we still have to have classes to get people through the curriculum in a timely manner so they don't spend $1 million. And because we don't have that kind of time, some people are going to fall through the cracks. Now, all people are capable of thinking at this level, but not all people have time, and time or are at the right place in their development. So sometimes we have to accept that the person just isn't going to get it. And that's really true with systems thinking. Probably only 50%. Why do I need to write my name when I can type it? Good question. Or even beyond that, why do I have to write my name when I can say it to my text to, my speech to text program? I don't need to be able to write it. And it's true. And it's a hard argument sometimes to overcome, actually. But one of the things I know about that argument, by the way, Raul, is that, people have certain ways that they learn things. And for a lot of people, learning is connected to a kind of tactile understanding that comes with writing down. I'm one of those people. I think people who are writers are like that. Like, I know something because I can write it down. And when I write it down, I know it. So it always has to be in my own words. I write something down in my own words, and then I know it. We miss that possibility in going right from, thinking to seeing it on the page by dictating it. I have to dictate now because I've got carpal tunnel pretty bad. And it is a whole thing to learn all by itself, how to dictate well and how to get it on the page. Anyway, that's a side issue to where we are. So we're asking people here, when you are trying to deal with other people's ideas, you have to be aware of their values, your relationship, their beliefs. All those things need to be in your mind, because truly we're trying to impress a different set of values on someone. We're trying to get someone to see that doing it this way, whether it's formal operations or systems thinking, is a better way in our complex social setting than doing it in ways that might be successful outside of our complex social setting. So concrete operations may be a good way to get along with your neighbors and friends, but they're not going to get you through fielding. And you can't have concrete operations once you have progressed beyond that. So you can see that there's kind of a cliff effect. There's kind of a cliff effect when you develop formal operations. And there's another cliff effect where you where you develop systems operations, kind of like jumping off a cliff, because you're not going to think the way you used to anymore. And you're not going to be able to see things the way the people around you saw them. So I'm constantly reminding us as we go along that there are social and emotional consequences to changing one's worldview, and some of them are unintended. So for example, when they taught bottom-up management at this big factory in Mexico where a lot of women worked, what they were teaching them is that people on the bottom of the line probably have the best idea of what could be done to improve production. So they involved the women in a lot of quality circles where they discussed problems and how they should be addressed. And what happened from there is that they went home and they wanted to be in charge of addressing problems in their own homes. So this caused quite a ruckus, as you might imagine, in Mexican families, which are highly patriarchal. So you never know what the social and emotional consequences are going to be of what you're teaching, even though you think it's a better way to function in cognitive terms. It may be horrendously difficult in emotional terms, and it may be hard to get there emotionally because you begin to understand that it's going to divide you from the people around you. Okay, next slide. I could talk forever, so I want to, on almost any topic, actually. So I want to be sure that we get to your questions, and I'm going to finish up here real quickly because we only have till 10:30. This is just an example of the difference here between stages. So if you ask, why should a person keep promises? You can find out what level of thinking your person is doing. A person should keep promises because it's the right thing to do. People will trust you, people expect it, and you might feel guilty if you break it. Next slide. A person should keep promises because a person's word should mean something. Broken promises can harm relationships. If people keep promises, they can depend on each other. Broken promises cause pain and reduce trust. So you can see right here how much more complicated that thought is about why you should keep promises. It has what would happen if you don't and what would happen if you do. So that's one of the interesting things about it. And it also takes into consideration meaning, pain, and trust. So those are all emotional issues as well as cognitive issues. Next slide. So this one is the highest level that she outlined in this particular argument. And it's important to keep promises. You get a plus side and a minus side. It's not always possible due to unforeseen circumstances. So you see how much more sophisticated that is than the previous one. The previous one was if you keep them this, if you don't keep them that. This includes the possibility that you wouldn't be able to keep it, as well as the problems that are caused by making a commitment and standing by it, or the possibility of standing by it. And that again comes to this final conclusion that it keeps society functioning if people keep their promises, because it builds a sense of trust. So you have a higher level of thinking that takes into account the broader system here, as well as the probability or possibility that you might not be able to keep it for good reasons. Okay, so we're constantly trying to complexify the way people think about certain problems. What happens if you do? What happens if you don't? What are the unforeseen things that could happen? Can we think of things that might happen that we're not expecting? And you can tell that becomes a major thought in something like the butterfly effect, where, you know, a butterfly flaps its wings in South America and causes a hurricane in New York, has to do with totally unforeseen circumstances. Next slide. All right, so here's the one that I really like, and this is what I would suggest that if you're interested in this topic, you get this handbook, and it's in our library. Yay! It's Nicolaitis and Eisenbacher, the Palgrave Handbook of Learning for Transformation. They make this point, which I think is so important, and I love the term liquid modernity, rapid change. Liquid modernity is a lovely phrase. Just the words are great. Requires flexibility and adaptation. One must be constantly ready and willing to change as we live in a series of crises, from war and pandemics to structural racism and growing inequality. Okay, so there is also a tremendous amount of stress around, since society is changing so quickly, we have to change our idea of how systems interact very quickly. If government changes, it changes everything. If regulations change, it changes everything. If economic system change, it changes everything. So we have to constantly be updating how we think about things. Next slide. Here is the bibliography that you asked for, Linda, and we will make sure that you all have it. And next slide. Questions and answers. All right, so there's maybe some in the chat room here. One of my nephews says, why do I need to? Yeah, right. All right, so anybody got questions about what we're talking about, or points you want to bring up, or issues that you understood as a problem as we went along? God, I was that clear, huh?
Here's the question from Roll.
Roll?
Yeah, hi, Judy. I guess maybe it's my focus on younger kids and stuff, but I guess I'm having a hard time situating the idea of self-actualization in everything that you've said here. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, self-actualization requires a level of contemplation or reflection that is like, when you're struggling towards self-actualization, you're also struggling with questions like, what do I want? Who am I? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? How do other people see me? How do I want them to see me? And you're moving up from, you have the support of that whole bottom of the pyramid, you know, you got enough to eat, you got enough air, you got enough shelter, you got security, you feel pretty comfortable in your living, in your situation, or perhaps uncomfortable because it's not fitting you very well, in order to tackle that problem of self-actualization. So I think that it's very likely, and of course there's no way to know this because Maslow never tested anybody for anything except his notion of self-actualization. So it'd be a really good question. We've had a lot of dissertations done using the measures of cognitive development to look at function one way or another. So for example, measures of cognitive development seem to be very helpful in predicting who will be a successful manager at the highest level, right? So we also are trying to look at the same time at whether those people are self-actualized, and nobody's really done that sort of thing. It would be it's a very interesting question. I just had a dissertation that I finished. God, this guy was in my he was in my shop for 12 years. And now I can only think of his first name, but Barry.
Barry Rubin.
What, Elena?
Barry Rubin.
Yes, exactly. That guy did a wonderful dissertation that took a long time, because he started out by getting recommendations from the organizational consultants that he knew about people that they felt were mature leaders, emotionally mature leaders. So he looked at emotional maturity, which was measured, he had a measurement of it, among people who were thought to be outstanding leaders, and was able to show that they use more developed defenses, they're sublimating more often, they're using intellectualization, which is my favorite defense, rather than projection or some other more primitive form of defense. They are regarded as people who listen to you and who understand you. So it is, in my mind at least, related to self-actualization, but there's not any kind of really clear one-to-one relationship. And we have never really looked at it that way, the relationship between self-realization and cognitive development hasn't been explored, except in this, very brief way that Barry went about it. And we had talked about doing measures of intellectual development, but he thought that that was one step further than he wanted to go. At the moment, it would require a whole nother raft of tests and selection process and so forth. So that is for a future time. However, I wouldn't be surprised at all to find a really strong relationship between self-realization and intellectual function, because in order to realize oneself, it's important to be able to understand and get around what are the blocks to self-realization in one's situation. So in terms of overcoming the obstacles to self-realization, being able to think through other people's points of view, how they're going to react, what they're going to do, how the system is going to react if you become more self-realized. And for example, you decide that you're going to take care of some of your own needs rather than just responding to everybody else's needs. That's really going to change everything. When a woman at midlife, postmenopausal woman, which according to Margaret Mead is one of the greatest forces on earth, a postmenopausal
I feel left out.
decides that she's going to go out into the world and she's going to make a difference in the world, and she's going to self-realize in terms of her values and ambitions. That is going to change her whole world and the world of every single person that depends on her. So there are huge social and emotional implications to all of these kinds of developmental things that we're talking about. Barry Rubin, pivotal development events in the lives of emotionally mature leaders. So he was really interested in what kind of background emotionally mature leaders had, but he was also able to measure emotional maturity. And that's a really important little piece of business, and probably relevant to your question, Ro, because I would think that the way Barry measures emotional development here is strongly related to self-realization.
Well, what's interesting to me is that you've talked a lot about what people think and what people believe, but I just wonder where what people do figures in as well. And I'm a big fan of Gail Prevet, who was somebody working in the 80s, mostly maybe 90s, and personality theory, where the emphasis was on the experience as well as the performance.
Mm-hmm.
They're talking about what you do and what you and how that strikes you emotionally, and that self-actualization really was occurred at the intersection, really, of that. But what strikes me is that each of those things maybe are somehow the track of your thinking has been, or your presentation has been parallel to any of that kind of. I just haven't. I wonder where
Yeah.
action and self-actualization figure, I guess. You know?
Yeah.
One thing-
I think that's wonderful research, and I'm sorry that we haven't sort of followed that thread. That sounds like a really interesting thread to me. Lenny, were you going to say something? Good morning, Lenny.
She's on mute.
Oh, you're muted. Lenny, you're muted. You're muted. You're
I just said, good evening, Judy. I just got back from work. It's dinner time right here, but I love this topic. And of course, I love listening to Judy. I've been listening to her, I think, for maybe what, 30 years? I can't years.
Exactly.
Anyway, this is wonderful stuff. I mean, and all I can say about awareness and adult development is, what else is there to help us figure out what's going on the planet and what's happening with people? I mean, I'm an activist.
Yeah.
I mean, and unless we can figure out a way to help advance the thinking of so many people, we are in for just a terrible period of time, maybe forever.
If you think of people as generally functioning at the concrete level, then you've got to make these things really concrete, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
also, I think there's a really important study that was done, and it's a very small study, it was done on the use of condoms. Okay, so they were trying to get people to use condoms.
Yeah.
So they did an experiment using 3 different approaches. One was completely informational. The other was a scare tactic, like what we've been using on climate change. And the other was making condoms look sexy. And the only one that worked was making condoms look sexy. People didn't care. They totally ignored all the scare stuff. So I think the approach that we take, especially through the media, to some of these things is not helping, because what draws people to listen about the problems is the horror of it and the drama of it and the background music on the media, you know? Whereas if we take a more positive approach, showing things like, I'm just reading National Geographic today, the, Iberian lynx has been saved from extinction. And now there's a 10-fold increase in the population of the Iberian lynx because of the things that the Spanish are doing to breed them in captivity and put them back out in the wild. I think more stories like that are likely to lead people to do things that will make change, because systems thinking is immobilizing.
Well, I understand. I agree.
Yeah.
Judy. But also, drawing Linda Irvin into this conversation. Those of us on the sustainability group or project. One of the things I've been banging on about is the importance of not. I mean, you can only deal with this if you start dealing with people's fears and their ability to sort of both face the trauma, look at it head on, and then do something about it. Yeah, and
Yeah.
so it's the problem with the condom one is people who need condoms are generally young. and the people who are, I also think incidentally that the people that are going to save the planet are going to be young.
Yeah.
Simply because I've been invited to lie down on the streets of London, central London, and have my hands glued to the pavement in protest. But they're gluing themselves to Parliament. Oh, it's fantastic. It is fantastic.
It's fantastic.
Yes, except I just didn't feel like doing it that day. I've been to jail, thank you, already. It was anyway, I do think that this whole business, the relationship between helping people feel good enough about themselves, positive about themselves, and not even, I mean, it's true that there's levels of self-awareness, and we'd love to have people at a higher level. But the truth of the matter is there's so many people that aren't.
Yeah.
The question is, what would make them feel better enough to help heal the planet and not just blow it up?
Well, it seems to me that what you're talking about is feelings of self-efficacy. And when we overwhelm people with how terrible the situation is and how it's out of control and how it's ruining everything, it overwhelms their feelings of self-efficacy, just like this argument that I was having with the guy on Neighborhood. He can't see that anything an individual can do would make a difference, but it does make a difference if we all do it together. And I think it's important to give people, when you're telling them about the horrors and the problems, you need to also give them the message that they can do something that will be efficacious about it. And I think that the media especially leave that out.
Well, I mean, because it really isn't their job.
Yeah, it's
That's
not their job to tell you what to do about it, just to tell you what's happening. Exactly.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that anymore. I mean, if they don't take on a role of telling the whole story, there's nothing going to be left. You know, the whole idea of both sidesism that has created what's happening in the US, giving equal weight to each side, has caused problems. So I think just the facts, ma'am, is not really working for us with the media. And
No, it's
also the way they emphasize it. Like the other day, a CNN correspondent said, oh my God, Biden isn't liked because there's a 25, economists say there's a 25% chance of a recession. Like that, and the way she said it, and 25% is not that big, but she used her language. That was all facts, but the way she talked made it sound like 25 was a big deal.
Yeah.
And again, this is where I go back to that basic skills stuff, because when I work with people in adult foundational skills, either reading and or math, I see a lot of self-actualization and understanding of a problem from just simply understanding rates, ratios, decimals, and percents.
absolutely.
And if we have over a third of the US cannot understand that.
I know. So it's really
It's a big problem. And yeah, if they didn't learn it in elementary school and we don't change the way we teach it to adults, we have a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, guys, it's 10:31 and the hour and a half simply disappeared. It was wonderful talking with you all. There's some ideas up here that are really good. Karen O'Brien, Stephen McIntosh, Kagan and some college. I think there's just thousands of ways to go from here. And it's really exciting to think about it in these larger terms, to think about what we're doing in these larger terms, about trying to help people emotionally as well as cognitively as they move through all of these problems, and trying to reinforce their feelings of self-efficacy. And Linda says she hopes I will do more of these. Thank you, Linda. I've been doing them every time Hillary and Elena ask me. So I'm probably be doing these on the day I die.
Well, I understand.
Oh, things haven't changed too much since the last time we talked 20 years ago. All right, you guys, thanks a lot. Bye. Have a wonderful time at the event that you're going to be at all day. It looks like it was really, really well planned, and I feel very supported by Elena and Hillary in doing this. So I'll be back and I'll see you guys soon.